Hey everyone, and welcome to a deep dive that could totally change how you look at budgeting. We're going to be tackling the 50-30-20 rule today. Something you might have seen floating around if you've been digging into personal finance stuff at all. It's gotten really trendy, but it also gets some skeptical side eye, you know? And rightfully so. Is it really as simple as it sounds? Can percentages really tame the wild beast that is our spending? That's what we're here to find out.
Yeah, I've seen my fair share of budgeting fads come and go. Trust me, some are way better than others, so I'm here to give you the no-nonsense breakdown. So you can decide if the 50-30-20 is worth your time.
Okay, so for anyone who's just tuning in, the basic idea is this. You split your after-tax income, 50% on needs, 30% on wants, 20% saves in debt. But I gotta admit, my first thought was, hold on, life is way more complicated than three little buckets.
You're not wrong to be cautious. One thing that I think is often glossed over is how different needs can be for people. The source we're looking at today actually highlights rent or mortgage, which, let's face it, can be a huge chunk of someone's income. Then you've got utilities, groceries, all those basics to keep a roof over your head. And food on the table, those are pretty universal needs.
Oh, absolutely. But you know what always gets me? Transportation. The source mentions how much the average household spends, and it's always way more than I expect. Suddenly that bus pass or a car payment hits different when you see the big picture.
Right. It's eye-opening. And this is where the 50-30-20, I think, starts to get real for people. Like, what happens when your needs are already pushing past that 50%? Is the whole thing just out the window then?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering too. The source does say that the rule is more like a guideline, which I think is reassuring. But what does that actually look like in practice? If you're already squeezed tight on rent, can you really magically cut back on groceries?
Well, that's where the flexibility comes in, I think. The source suggests a few approaches. Cutting costs where you can is one, but that's not always easy. Sometimes it means taking a hard look at your wants and being a little stricter there, just to free up some cash to shift over. And it doesn't have to be an overnight change, maybe starting at 55% for needs and then slowly working it down. That can be a lot less overwhelming for people.
Gradual change. I like that. It makes it feel less like a financial crash diet and more like building healthy habits.
Exactly. And speaking of enjoying life, let's not forget about those wants. That juicy 30% where things get fun.
Oh, here's where I shine. Dining out, catching a movie, new clothes travel. This category practically screams treat yourself. It makes all the responsible budgeting stuff feel less scary, honestly.
It's definitely important to factor in that enjoyment. The source emphasizes that this isn't about deprivation, but there is a really smart point in there about setting boundaries.
Wait, boundaries on fun? Is that allowed?
Think of it like this. If you blow through that 30% in the first week, you're left with nothing for the rest of the month. And you've probably dipped into your savings or debt repayment. Not so fun anymore, right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
The source actually mentions this fun money idea, setting aside a specific amount each month, just for guilt-free enjoyment. No more mental math about whether that concert ticket means skipping groceries later.
Okay, I like that. Boundaries for the win. Now, I'm no stranger to the concept of saving, but even I gotta admit, 20% feels kind of ambitious.
It's definitely a commitment, but remember, this covers more than just your piggy bank for a rainy day. We're talking the emergency fund. The superhero that swoops in when your car decides to break down? Or surprise medical bills attack?
Oh, right, the grown-up stuff. The source also talks about retirement savings, which honestly feels so far off when you're just trying to make rent this month.
It's easy to push it aside, I get it. But just think of it as an investment in your future self. Even small amounts add up over time, especially with the magic of compound interest. And then there's the debt monster, lurking under the bed for a lot of people.
Yeah, the source doesn't sugarcoat that. High-interest debt can be a huge drag, but dedicating part of that 20% to paying it down can save you a ton in the long run.
Absolutely. It's basically like giving yourself a guaranteed return on investment. I always find it helpful to see real numbers. So let's just imagine someone who's earning $3,000 after taxes each month. With the 50-30-20 split, that's $1,500 for needs, $900 for those fun wants, and $600 towards their future. Makes it a bit more tangible, right?
It does. I'm already trying to picture how those proportions would apply to my own income. Okay, let's get real for a second. Why does anyone think this rule actually works? What's the secret sauce?
Honestly, a big part of it is the simplicity. Most people I know don't love complicated spreadsheets or tracking every penny. This is a framework that anyone can grasp pretty quickly. You know where your money's going, and it encourages you to be mindful without feeling overly restrictive.
Like you're not giving up lattes forever. You're just being more conscious of how many you're grabbing each week.
Exactly.
The source also mentions the psychological side of things, which I find fascinating. Budgeting can feel stressful, but this rule seems to aim for that balance of feeling in control without being totally overwhelmed.
It's true. When you're not constantly worried about money, it frees up so much mental space for other things. Plus, knowing you're actively working towards your goals, whether it's saving, paying off debt, or just enjoying those wants guilt-free, that can be a huge confidence boost.
Yeah, I'm starting to see the appeal here. It's not just about numbers, it's about that sense of empowerment,
Yeah.
right? But even with all this, I'm guessing there are some common questions or concerns that pop up for people. What have you noticed people kind of getting hung up on?
Oh, definitely. We touched on one already. What if your needs just don't fit neatly into that 50%? And that's where digging into the source's advice, I think, gets really helpful. There's a whole section dedicated to that what if scenario, and it's packed with really actionable strategies.
Oh, good. Because I know I'm not the only one side-eyeing that 50% with my rent prices.
Yeah.
But before we go full problem-solving mode, I'm curious about something else. What if you're in the opposite situation? No debt to worry about, already got a decent emergency fund going. Does that 20% just become a savings free-for-all?
That's where things get exciting. If you're debt-free, that 20% can be fully focused on whatever your goals are, whether it's maxing out retirement contributions, saving for a down payment on a house, or even that dream vacation you've always wanted to take.
So it really does become a choose-your-own-adventure kind of situation.
Precisely. And this ties into another question that I see come up a lot. Can I tweak those percentages at all?
Hmm.
You know, the 50-30-20, it's meant to be a starting point, not a rigid law. So if someone is laser focused on paying off debt, maybe they bump that up to 25%, even if it means cutting back a bit on wants or even savings. It's about finding what works for your life.
So customization is key,
Mm-hmm.
which is reassuring. I'm already feeling like this rule might be a lot less intimidating and more flexible than I initially thought. But before we get too comfy, I'm curious about the practical side of things. How do you actually make this a habit and not just a good intention?
That's where the rubber meets the road, right? One of the most powerful tools I think that the source highlights is automation. Think of it this way. You set up those automatic transfers to your savings account or debt repayment, and the money's gone before you even have a chance to miss it. No more relying on willpower alone.
Okay, that's actually genius.
Yeah.
I am the queen of good intentions. But life just gets so busy, and then suddenly it's the end of the month, and I'm like, oops, there goes my savings goal again.
Yeah. We've all been there. Automation takes the emotion out of it. It's like building a little robot army to fight for your financial future, even when you're distracted by shiny things.
I love that analogy.
Mhm.
But speaking of shiny things, the source talks a lot about budgeting apps, which honestly can be kind of overwhelming. There are so many out there. Does it really matter which one you use, or is it more about just picking one and sticking with it?
There's definitely some truth to just picking one and diving in. But the cool thing is a lot of apps are designed with the 50-30-20 rule in mind. The source actually mentions Plumchip and Monzo, which I've heard good things about. They can like automatically categorize your spending, give you those nice little visual breakdowns, even help you set savings targets.
So they're like taking all those messy receipts and turning them into something useful. I'm all about anything that makes budgeting less of a chore. It's like having a personal finance coach in your pocket,
Mhm.
but way less judgmental.
Exactly. And the best part is as you're tracking your spending, you start to see patterns that you might not have noticed before. Maybe you're spending way more on takeout than you thought, or that subscription you never use is still draining your account. Knowledge is power, right? Especially when it comes to your money.
Totally. You know, one thing that keeps coming up for me is this idea that budgeting is all about restriction. But the way the source talks about the 50-30-20 rule, it feels more like empowerment. Like
Yeah.
you're making conscious choices instead of just letting your money vanish into the void.
That's such a great point. What's so fascinating about this rule is that it's not just about numbers, it's about aligning your spending with your values. Do you value that daily latte enough to potentially cut back on something else? Is paying down debt a bigger priority than that weekend trip? These are the questions it prompts you to consider.
Okay, that's a total mindset shift. It's not about saying no to everything fun. It's about saying yes to the things that matter most. Speaking of things that matter, the source doesn't shy away from the debt conversation, which, let's be real, can be a bit of a downer. But they frame it in a way that almost makes paying it down sound exciting.
Right. It's not just about getting rid of this burden. It's about actively investing in your future freedom. Every dollar you put towards high-interest debt is a dollar you're not losing to those crazy interest charges.
Yeah, it's like you're fighting back against those financial gremlins. claiming your hard-earned cash for yourself. And I gotta admit, there's something really satisfying about watching those debt balances shrink. It's like a visible reminder that you're making progress. You're taking control.
Absolutely. And that sense of accomplishment can be incredibly motivating. It's like you're building momentum,
Yeah.
proving to yourself that you can handle your finances and reach your goals.
Okay. I'm feeling inspired. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. We've talked about automation apps mindset. Is there anything else that can help people actually stick with this February 30-20 rule once that initial excitement wears off?
This might sound simple, but one of the most effective things you can do is involve a friend or family member in your journey, sharing your goals, celebrating wins, even just venting about those budgeting frustrations. It makes the whole process less isolating.
Oh, that's so true. I've tried budgeting solo before, and it's so easy to get discouraged when you feel like you're the only one struggling. Having someone in your corner cheering you on can make all the difference. Plus, it's way more fun to celebrate those milestones together.
Absolutely. And even if you don't have a personal cheering squad, there are tons of online communities out there where people share tips, support each other, and celebrate wins big and small. You don't have to go it alone.
We've covered a lot of ground here. It's amazing how much depth there is to this seemingly simple rule. I'm feeling way more informed and optimistic about the 50-30-20 approach now, and hopefully our listeners are too. But before we jump into the Q&A, I'm curious, what's one thing that you'd want someone to take away from this deep dive so far?
For me, it's this idea that budgeting doesn't have to be restrictive or scary. The 50-30-20 rule, when applied thoughtfully, can be a really powerful tool for aligning your spending with your values and creating a life you love. Both now and in the future, it's not about deprivation. It's about conscious choice and empowerment.
I love that. It's a reminder that we have more control over our finances than we often realize, and that taking charge doesn't have to mean sacrificing all the fun stuff. But of course, no deep dive is complete without tackling some real-life questions. So let's dive into those listener questions. First up, we've got someone who's grappling with the age-old dilemma. I'm finding it tough to draw the line between needs and wants. Any tips? It's a question we all face, right? Where's that boundary between essential and enjoyable?
Oh, it's so tricky because it's not just about the item itself. It's about your individual circumstances and your values. The source gives a good starting point, though. Ask yourself, could I live without this? If the answer is yes, it's probably a want.
Okay, that makes sense. Like groceries are a need, but those gourmet cupcakes I keep buying, definitely a want. Although sometimes I convince myself they're a need for my mental well-being.
We've all been there. Another thing the source highlights is thinking about the purpose. Is this for basic survival, health, safety? Okay, that points towards needs. If it's more about enjoyment, even if it's something you really love, it probably leans more towards wants.
So it's about being honest with yourself, and maybe a little less justification for those impulse buys. Speaking of tough choices, our next question is one I'm sure resonates with a lot of folks. I'm barely covering my needs with 50% of my income. How can I realistically save 20% on top of that? It's a valid concern, especially when so many people are living paycheck to paycheck.
It's definitely a challenge. But the source reassures us that the 20% is a target, not a punishment. It's more about building the habit and making progress where you can. Even if you start with 5% or 10% saved, that's still a huge win.
Small steps, big results, right? The source also mentions revisiting those needs and seeing if there are any cuts possible. It's not always fun, but sometimes negotiating a lower bill or finding a cheaper grocery store can free up some wiggle room.
Absolutely. And it might also mean getting creative with those wants. Maybe instead of dinner out every week, it's a potluck night with friends. It's not about deprivation, it's about finding joy within your means.
Okay, last question. And this one's a doozy. Should I pay off debt first or build an emergency fund? It's like the ultimate financial chicken or the egg situation.
It is a tough one. And honestly, there's no one-size-fits-all answer. But the source does give some solid guidance. If you're battling high-interest debt, like those credit card balances that seem to grow overnight, tackling those first is usually the smartest move.
Yeah. You have to stop that bleeding before you can really start building right. The source mentions those high-interest charges can really sabotage your progress, even if you're diligently saving at the same time.
Yeah, it's like trying to run a marathon with weights strapped to your ankles. Once you've got that high-interest debt under control, then you can focus on building that emergency fund, knowing that it'll actually protect you instead of just being eaten up by interest payments.
Okay, that clears things up. It's all about building that strong foundation one step at a time.
Well, we've reached the end of our deep dive, and I gotta say, I'm feeling way more informed and optimistic about the 50-30-20 rule. It's not just a set of numbers, it's a framework for making conscious choices about your money and your life.
Exactly. What I hope listeners take away from this is that sense of empowerment. You can take control of your finances, even if it feels overwhelming at first. The 50-30-20 rule is a great starting point, but the real magic is in finding what works for you, experimenting, adjusting, and celebrating those wins along the way. Perfectly said. It's a reminder that personal finance is a journey, not a destination. And it's a journey we can all choose to make a little more enjoyable, a little less stressful, and a lot more aligned with our values.
So as you go forth into the world of budgeting, remember, you got this. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Utilize those amazing tools we talked about. And most importantly, be kind to yourself throughout the process.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. And remember, even small steps can lead to big changes when it comes to your financial well-being. You hold the power to shape your future one mindful choice at a time.